This is Dr. Rosie Kuhn, and this podcast series is called Spiritual Immersion, Taking the Plunge. And the intention of these podcasts is to support and empower you to stand in this practice, to stand in what you're in terms of that relationship with your self that you may have ignored or denied or distracted yourself from, but is calling you to a greater degree. And that calling is probably comes and goes, but it's really important, that calling comes and goes, and sometimes it gets stronger and sometimes it's not so strong. But to follow that calling is, I think, what we're here to do. I know for me, it's what I'm here to do. And I just encourage you to look at, question, be curious about, is there a calling that's calling you to explore and expand your sense of self to include your humanness versus just the ego part of you. The ego is sort of the shorthanded version of that part of you that doesn't want to be connected to your humanness and your vulnerability, but also to connect you with your spiritual self, which is anything but vulnerable and sensitive. I mean, it's sensitive, but not in the way of what we try to avoid. We try to avoid our spiritual self sometimes because it doesn't make sense, and it's so often quite the contrary to our consensus view of reality. So all of that is what I'm about here in these podcasts. I've written a number of books on the subject, working on one called Spiritual Immersion, Taking the Plunge. But you can find blogs and videos and books on various elements of this spiritual immersion process on Amazon and or at my website, theparadigmshifts.com. So today I want to engage in the conversation that is about sleep. Quite often there's there's a whole continuum for people who are either sleeping all the time or exhausted all the time, or people who are not sleeping at all, or someplace in between. And sleep is a really interesting and important issue to discuss in terms of this spiritual immersion process or emergence process, in that there is sometimes we have the word for it, the I can't sleep, or the narcolepsy, which is I'm sleeping all the time. But that desire to sleep, and our science and research says it's important to sleep, it's required, and there are those times when you find yourself sleepless. And I know that's true for myself. And, some things to look at, first of all, is what are you eating? So, for instance, if you're eating sugar and desserts, quite often in the middle of the night, it's when your insulin drops because you've had so much sugar or desserts or whatever, your insulin drops. And so you're waking up to say, hey, I need some more sugar. I need some more sustenance. So that's one thing that a number of people have told me made a difference, is that they stopped having dessert at night, or they stopped drinking alcohol, which also lowered their blood sugar level, so that there was a consistency and they didn't wake up because of that blood sugar drop. So the other thing I'm finding is that as I'm changing my diet and reducing the amount of things that I'm sensitive to, I'm also sleeping better. So for instance, right now I've eliminating more rice and more potatoes and more wheat products, and eating more ancient grains versus refined grains and carbohydrates. I'm sleeping better. Go figure. So those kinds of elements of our diet, or the other thing is the amount of exercise. Quite often if people exercise, they sleep better. Or if they meditate before they go to bed, they sleep better. Or if they reduce the amount of time that they're in front of their electronics, they sleep better. So those are elements, and quite often nobody wants to do any of that. I find it so fascinating when people tell me they're not sleeping well, and I'll suggest a number of things. They're not interested in changing those things. It's like, okay, I wasn't interested in changing those things when I was more committed to my comfort zone, and that eating was a big part of that. When I got more committed to health and well-being and really attending to my wholeness, my whole being and well-being, then I was able to eliminate more things, and finding the results are pretty cool. Very cool that I'm sleeping better. The other thing is I'm finding is if I have something that's a protein-ish thing before I go to bed, I will sleep through the night, or I'll sleep much, much better, much deeper. And so for me, I've been having maybe almost like a half cup of yogurt before I go to bed. And oh my God, I'm sleeping better. So that's part of it. That's part of it. The other part is, I think, and Sai Baba, who's a guru guy who passed away a number of years ago, he said, you're going to get the sleep you need, but a lot of spiritual work is occurring at night because there's nothing else to do. You're not creating any other distractions, so you're present and you're in bed, and most likely, and you're available to spirit to do work. And so quite often, that's when the work takes place. I've had this theory for a long time that most people don't give themselves much quiet time during their day. Meditation sometimes can be a practice, but it's not being present to yourself necessarily. In a meditation, you're practicing your reading, or you're meditating on a mantra, or you're focused on no thought. But that place where you're really present to yourself and attending to yourself and listening to yourself, most importantly, and responding to that part of you that's maybe speaking and you're communicating with, that can only take place when there's some quiet time. And so quite often, that's the middle of the night, or, once you've gone to bed. So that's really important to think about, is that this is a time for you to be with you. And I have found so many more insights and so much deeper presence to myself in the middle of the night. So much presence, greater presence to spirit and the communication with my higher self, my angels, my guides, who's ever giving me some wisdom that I really need to hear and want to hear. That's the big deal, is I want to hear it. And if I don't make myself available to it during the day, guess what's going to show up? I'm going to be awake during the night. And I came to expect that, which was kind of nice, because I wasn't anxious, I wasn't upset, I wasn't frustrated, I wasn't saying, I'm supposed to sleep, and go to my doctor and get some medication to help me sleep. And the interesting thing is, when I would take melatonin or some sleep aid, or even something, a medication, it didn't work. It didn't work, because Spirit's got a higher hand in this thing than pharmaceuticals. So if I needed to be awake, I was going to be awake no matter what. So again, consider, if you're having sleep, if you're awake in the middle of the night, consider, what are you eating before you go to bed, or even a few hours before you go to bed? Are you exercising? Are you de-stressing before you go to bed? Are you quieting your environment before you go to bed, so that maybe you've got some relaxation and mindfulness time, like mindfulness as in being with yourself prior to going to sleep? So those are things to consider. And sometimes God, Spirit, the universe, oneness, wants you awake and present, awake and present to you and it. So that's a really important element to think about. So what I mentioned, Sai Baba said, you will get the sleep you need. And you don't have to worry about that. Just be present to what you're being called to. Again, that word called. If you're called to be awake, be awake. Be present to what's being given to you, what's being shared with you, what you're being present to, what you're being sensitive to. So for instance, I would, when I had an argument with my son, and we hadn't talked for a while, I would just have this internal dialogue with myself. an internal dialogue with him, making it up. Like, here's what I would say. If he said this, I would say that. And he would say this, and I would say that. And it went on and on and on. And I go, what's the point of that? Because I may never talk to him again. This isn't happening. Why am I entertaining myself with this? What's the purpose of this? What's this conversation about for me? What am I trying to get? And I was trying to get a sense of power and control, because the point is the source of that conversation was coming from a sense of powerlessness and helplessness. I can't control his perspective. I can't control his choices in the world. And so my conversation was to avoid that feeling and sensation of powerlessness. And yet, the first step of any 12-step program is I admit that I am powerless over people, places, and things. So it allowed me to drop into that place of, okay, I am powerless over this situation with my son. I am powerless over the circumstances, and I admit that now. And I'll turn this over to my higher power, because there's nothing I can do about this. There's no point in me spending and spinning my wheel, spending time thinking about things that I may never ever say or have an opportunity to say. So that was my practice, is to turn it over. But had I not had that time in the middle of the night to really listen to, what am I trying to do here? What am I trying to avoid? Those are the two questions. What am I trying to get here? What am I trying to avoid? And 99% of the time, it's like I'm trying to avoid being human and feeling my humanness. So again, Sai Baba says, you'll get the sleep you need. I say, you'll get the sleep you need. That was my experience every single day, was I'd wake up, it's like, okay, didn't sleep much, grumble, but I actually had enough sleep, and I was rested, and I was able to be cognizant to everything I needed to be cognizant to. And if I needed to take a nap, I would take a nap. But generally speaking, I didn't. I just needed to be present and committed to this process, because that was what I was called to, and I didn't have a choice. And I know a lot of people who go through spiritually transformative experiences, whether it's Kundalini or chakras or other spiritual emergence processes, where sleep isn't necessarily available when they want it. And it just becomes an acceptance so that they can continue to move on through the process. All right, that's it for today. Big blessings to you. If you have any comments, email me at rosie@theparadigmshifts.com. If you know people who would find value in these podcasts, please forward them to them and let them know about it. All right, big hugs. Bye for now.